Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to speak to you this morning for a few moments and try and convey to you. I had hoped to do so visually, and now you'll just have to be content with listening to my American accent and telling you what exactly is going on and what has been going on in that portion of the world now known as Biafra. In 1967, on June the 30th, civil war broke out between Nigeria and its eastern region. Nigeria was a country of roughly between 65 and 75 million people. In the eastern section, roughly 14 million people. And on that day, both of them started to fight each other. It would have been a normal war, if you can call war normal, except for the fact that the federal government of Nigeria put a blockade, a naval blockade and an aerial blockade, as well as a land blockade, on the eastern region and cut it off completely from access to its normal food supplies. The reason for this has been repeated on many occasions by top federal officials, and that was that, well, we'll starve them out. The federal government realized that it could not achieve a quick military victory by normal war methods, so they decided on the blockade as a more effective and a cheaper way of subduing the people in the eastern region. For 6 months, the blockade was in effect, and no one knew anything at all about what was going on within the blockaded region. It was impossible to get in or get out of it. Then some Biafrans initiated a little airlift of their own with the aid of some American friends, and once every 2 weeks or so, an old Super Constellation plane ran the blockade to bring in supplies to the Biafran armed forces. And this was going on for a few months before anybody except those involved knew where the plane came from, where it went to, and what it carried. All of this time, I was in New York City. I had come out of the country just a few weeks before the blockade was imposed, and I was very anxious to get back. But because of the blockade, I could not get back to my superiors or to my high school, where I had been the principal. Imagine the students were having a good time. Their principal was in New York. He was cut off by a blockade, and I don't know what went on, but the school soon closed, I understood. However, it was impossible to find out what was going on or get in or get out. And then, as chance would have it, on one afternoon in New York, I met this Biafran doctor who told me of the conditions in the country, that the blockade was having a very serious effect. There were no medicines, there was no food, food supplies were running very low, and that they were really in a bad way, particularly for medicines at that time. This is December 1967 I'm talking about now. So he asked me, could I do anything to get the medicines? I said, there's no trouble in getting medicines. The trouble is, how do you get it to Biafra? Oh, he said, leave that to me. There's no trouble in getting it in. I know a way. So I said, well, if I'm going to get you medicines, and I'm anxious to get back there myself, I would like to go back with the medicines, if you know the way. He was very reluctant to introduce me to this secret way. So I had to do a little bit of bargaining. I said, okay, no way, no medicines. So we compromised, and on Christmas Eve 1967, I landed at midnight in a deserted airstrip in the middle of Biafra in a darkened plane. I didn't know who the crew were, I didn't know the names, knew nothing about them. I had my faith and trust in God alone. And even more so when I discovered that the nice bright lights that were shining all around us and exploding were not fireworks for Christmas, but flak, anti-aircraft fire. And I only discovered that a few minutes before we landed. And we'd been going through it for about the best part of an hour. Thank God I was ignorant of flak and anti-aircraft fire, or I'd have lost all confidence. However, 5 minutes before we descended, we're still lazing along, going through these lights and all the rest of it. The next thing, the pilot shouts out of the cockpit, "Hold on, we're going in." So I'm looking out, see where are we going to? I can see nothing, only darkness. I know the area that's underneath, at least I think I do. I've been there before, I've lived there. I know it's all jungle and palm trees and swamps and what have you. But I know that there is an old airstrip, and usually it was well lit up and all the rest of it. I'm looking for those lights and I see nothing. Next thing I know, the plane is swiveling and swirling and spiraling at a fantastic rate. We're being thrown from one side to the other. Stomachs are up in our mouths and so on, but we hold on for dear life. And the next thing, we just feel we're touching something. This time, of course, I've made my peace with God. I've just told him I've been sorry for all the things I've done wrong in my lifetime. And it's amazing how they come so clearly to your mind at a moment like that. You see everything in one flash, 1 second. You see everything you've done wrong in your lifetime, and you get terribly sorry. And here I am preparing to meet my Maker, and I feel this touch, and I say, well, okay, this is it. And at the same moment, I saw these lights. And as quickly as they came on, they went out again. And meantime, I find we're running along, and I say, well, we seem to be on something anyhow. And let's hope we're not just going to end up now wrapped around the palm trees. However, a few seconds later, we're at a halt, and out into the darkness, climb down a ladder, and eager hands are waiting, carried on the shoulders of some people and transferred down along. And finally, we find that we're at the Biafran secret airstrip. So for the next hour or so, we're offloading the cargo. I take my medicines. I inquire from some of the military people there how I can get to the nearest mission to meet some of my companions and friends. They're preparing for Christmas services and the coming of the Messiah and the Redeemer and everything else. And instead of that, to find myself walking in after almost 6 months' absence. And they don't know anything about this plane. They just couldn't believe that I'd come from the outside world. I'm afraid the Messiah was forgotten that night. There was more attention paid to my coming back. So after consultations for the next 10 days with my superiors and meeting the medical people, especially in all the hospitals, discovered that the situation was really drastic. I got lists from them as to what medicines were required and saw for myself in one particular clinic run by the Scots Presbyterian Mission at a place called Umahia, there were 200 cases of people who had been burned in a fire and badly burned. And they had them lying out on the grass outside. There was no room in the hospital itself. It was already jam-packed. And the only thing they had to treat the burns was some flour. And they were rubbing the flour on the wounds, on the burns, trying to soothe the pain. Nothing else. No bandages, no nothing. The sisters there and the different nursing sisters had torn their slips and everything they had. Bed sheets were a thing of the past. They had long since been used as bandages and so on. And it was the same in all the different hospitals and clinics. So I got a very, very vivid impression of a very drastic situation. The starvation at that time wasn't too serious. But I came back 10 days later. I had made arrangements with the pilots that I'd be waiting for them the next time they came back. They told me where to be and who to meet and so on. I was under strict security, not to mention how I came or who I came with or anything. So I maintained my part of the bargain. I was at the point of pickup 10 days later and got back to Europe. And when back in Europe, I started going around the different churches because I had taken mail with me from all the different missionaries who were inside. The only white people or foreigners who were inside the blockaded region at that stage were roughly 200 Irish Catholic missionaries, 100 mainly Scots and British, mostly from the Presbyterian churches and the Methodist churches. They were the only foreigners who were inside the blockade at that time, and they were all missionaries. So I went to the different churches, delivered the mail, and this was the first contact that the churches had had with their missionaries for almost 6 months. They read the mail, they discovered how bad things were for themselves, and we initiated then the first efforts at a real big airlift. We got together enough supplies to take one plane, complete with almost, I think we had 10.5 tons of medicine and food, and we got that back to Biafra in February, the middle of February in '68. It was a one-shot effort, but the effects of it it worked so well that really impressed all the agencies. At this stage, of course, they were still very reluctant to involve themselves in going through a blockade, because it meant getting fired at and shot at and so on. However, one of my companions decided at that stage that we were really banging our heads against stone walls, trying to tell people and describe to them what was happening. It would be much better if we got in some television people, some newspaper men, and let them see for themselves. And if they were impressed, they would tell the story for us. So we concentrated on our next flight in trying to get some newsmen. It took us 3 months or 4 months before we could get one single newspaper man who was anyway interested in going to Biafra. And we got them down there in June, at the end of May, beginning of June. And this was the first real awakening that you people had, if you recall. Life magazine, CBS, NBC, they all trotted out the story around summer of last year. The war has been going on for a year at that stage. And by this time, the full effects of the blockade were beginning to be felt. The children were beginning to die. They were undernourished, no proteins. Their stomachs were distending, their spindly little legs, their hair was turning golden and all the rest of it. And they were dying at the rate of 6,000 a day at that particular point. That figure rose to 10,000 a day by late fall. And at this stage, everybody, or almost everybody throughout the world, got very worked up, especially the churches. Appeals were made to the governments. The governments were making pious statements, but could do nothing about it. The Red Cross were appealed to. They made efforts. They set up teams to investigate and to negotiate with the Nigerians and with the Biafrans and so on. But they were getting nowhere. And finally, the churches decided that this situation was so serious, with up to 10,000 mainly children dying every day, there was no time for diplomacy. And in August of last year, spearheaded by the Lutheran churches of Scandinavia, we founded what is now known as Joint Church Aid International. And Joint Church Aid International is a consortium of all the churches of Europe and the United States. They base themselves on the island of San Tomé, 300 miles south of Biafra, and every night since August of last year, flights, mercy flights carrying food and medicine have gone in up to last night with 16 flights landing in Biafra last night from the island of San Tomé. The total number of flights since August of last year is 4,136 flights, operated, financed, paid for the whole lot, maintained by Joint Church Aid International, delivering over 40,000 tons of supplies. With the effort of the churches, the death rate has been cut down, and we had it almost down to a few hundred a week up to June the 5th. In February of this year, on to June, the Red Cross bucked up and they matched our tonnage. They operated an airlift. They delivered roughly 200 tons a night, the same as ourselves, and we managed to keep, with the combined effort of the Red Cross and the churches, we managed to reduce the death rate to a couple of hundred a week. But on the night of June the 5th, the Nigerian MiG fighter shot down a Red Cross plane. And since that night, the Red Cross have not flown. So we've had a retrogression. The numbers have started growing again. And we are desperately now trying to maintain the figure at 1,000 or less, if we can. But it's impossible to feed 1.5 million. And that is what we're endeavoring to do, to give 1 meal a day to 1.5 million children first, nursing mothers, and old people. They are the only ones that we feed. We refuse to feed any men or boys or any males whatsoever, except male infants. Now, the churches have carried this burden all along. This would not have been possible with the normal church collections and supplies and all the rest of it, were it not for the fact that we've had tremendous support from all over the world, from groups in almost every town and village and city. In the Swiss Alps, you can go there and you can find a small little village of 300 people tucked away in the Alps, and you'll find either in the church an appeal being made for Biafra, or even out in the street you will see some little sign, support the local church effort for Biafra. And the same is true in Japan, the same in Australia, and so on. This has enabled us to keep the airlift going. Here in the United States, we have been very successful over the past few months in keeping our segment of the airlift going, because we have an American segment known as Joint Church Aid USA, and this is operated by the Church World Service and the Catholic Relief Services combined, and funded and financed by the American Jewish Emergency Committee, representing 22 synagogues. This has helped us to keep a regular supply of food, medicines, and clothing to the people down there. As I speak to you now, it's takeoff time in San Tomé. The first planes are taking off. They're heading out over the ocean of this little island. It's a very pleasant tropical island. And one likes the scenery, enjoys the very friendly people on San Tomé. But a half an hour out of San Tomé, you run into these little red balls and this fireworks. And you forget about the little tropical island. You're running through the flak, the anti-aircraft fire, and the land batteries are opening up. For a half an hour after you go through the initial flak, the pilot is looking for the landing strip, because the initial one that I landed on in 1967 has long since been captured. And now we land on a roadway in the middle of the jungle. It's a 75-foot wide roadway. The palm trees have been cut on either side in order to make sure that they don't chop off the wings of the plane, but it's as tight as that. There's very little room between the wingtips and the nearest trees as one lands. The pilots look for a red light on top of a palm tree. They go by their compasses. There's no radio contact. They go by their compass to a certain point, and then they start looking for this red light. And this is just an ordinary kerosene lamp painted red on top of a palm tree. But it should be in the various, I don't know what the exact figures are, but within a certain radius anyhow. And once that is found, then they get their direction from there, and they swing due east or due west or whatever it is, and they fly for 5 minutes more, and then they get their code word from the ground. The radio radio silence is then broken. Contact is made by means of a code. If the correct answer comes back, the same old message, hold on boys, we're going down. And the pilots now, they're so accustomed to carrying strange clergymen, they say, Padre, you get in touch with the man above that we make it. So you pray while they guide the plane down in this spiral. And the same story, no lights until the last 2 seconds before touchdown. There's been an added danger in the last few months, not just succeeding in landing, that's not enough now. We've been more than lucky to date. We've managed to survive with only 8 crashes. We've lost 20 crew members, but out of 4,000, that is some record. But now in the past few months, the Nigerians are very, very seriously trying to eliminate this airlift, and they send bombers over. They don't know where the roadway is. They can't see. It's covered over during the daytime. At nighttime, of course, it's pitch dark. There's no light, so they can't find it. So they float around waiting for the planes to come in. They hear that radio contact, and they zone into the area, and they watch for the lights. Usually, they're out of range when the lights go on, and the lights are gone off before they can get exact bearings on it themselves. But they know it's down there someplace. So they just zone around and drop bombs indiscriminately. And we've lost quite a number of relief workers on the ground after the planes have landed. In fact, the last 2 trips I made in, we landed to the accompaniment of 6 bombs on either side of the plane. As we were bouncing along the roadway, bombs were dropping on either side of us. And as one of the relief workers said, listen, it's okay, can't you come in normal? Why do you want to have to put on an act just because you're back? And that's the kind of life we're living. That's the kind of thing we're doing. And we're doing this in order to try and save children. 1.5 million children and old people have died in the past year due to this blockade. That is more people than have died in Vietnam. There seems to be no political solution. While politicians argue, we of the combined churches are endeavoring to take food to save children. And anything that you can do to help us, I know will be very greatly appreciated. I'll leave the local effort to Reverend Price now to explain to you what is taking place here in your own city. Thank you very much for having the patience to listen to me.